The life of Joseph, son of Jacob and Rachel, is one of the most inspiring and powerful narratives in the Bible. Found in the book of Genesis, Joseph's story is a testimony of God's faithfulness, sovereignty, and providence. Throughout his life, Joseph experienced profound suffering, betrayal, and rejection, yet he remained faithful to God. In return, God used Joseph's life not only to bless him, but also to save countless others, including the nation of Israel. Joseph's journey from a favored son to a slave, and then from a prisoner to the second most powerful man in Egypt, is a testament to how God can turn even the darkest situations into something beautiful for his glory. Joseph's early life and the favor of his father. Joseph was the 11th of Jacob's 12 sons and the firstborn of Rachel, the wife whom Jacob deeply loved. From the very beginning, Joseph was favored by his father Jacob. This favoritism was made evident when Jacob gave Joseph a special gift, a richly ornamented coat, often called a coat of many colors. This coat symbolized Jacob's special affection for Joseph, setting him apart from his brothers. However, Jacob's open favoritism toward Joseph caused deep resentment and jealousy among his brothers. This animosity only grew when Joseph shared dreams that he had received from God. In these dreams, Joseph saw visions of his brothers and even his parents bowing down before him. These dreams were prophetic, foretelling Joseph's future rise to power, but at the time, they only fueled his brothers' hatred. Despite the challenges of family dynamics, it's important to see how God's hand was already at work in Joseph's life. From a young age, God was revealing his plans and purposes to Joseph, even if those around him could not yet understand them. Betrayal. And the journey to Egypt. Joseph's life took a tragic turn when his brothers' jealousy boiled over into a plan to rid themselves of him. One day, when Joseph went to check on his brothers as they were tending sheep, they conspired to kill him. However, Reuben, the eldest brother, convinced them not to take Joseph's life. Instead, they threw him into a pit with the intention of leaving him there. Later, an opportunity arose when a caravan of Ishmaelite traders passed by. The brothers decided to sell Joseph into slavery for 20 pieces of silver, thus sending him away to Egypt. To deceive their father, they dipped Joseph's coat in goat's blood and presented it to Jacob, leading him to believe that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal. At this moment, Joseph's life seemed to spiral into a nightmare. Betrayed by his own flesh and blood, separated from his beloved father, and sold into slavery in a foreign land, Joseph must have felt abandoned and lost. Yet, despite these overwhelming circumstances, God was with Joseph. Even in the darkest moments, God was orchestrating events for a greater purpose. Joseph in Potiphar's house. In Egypt, Joseph was sold to Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard. Despite being a slave, Joseph quickly rose to prominence in Potiphar's household. God's favor rested upon him, and everything Joseph touched prospered. Potiphar noticed this and placed Joseph in charge of his entire household, trusting him with all his affairs. Genesis 39:2 says, "The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master." Even in slavery, Joseph's faith in God did not waver. His success was not due to his own strength or abilities, but to the blessing of God upon his life. Joseph's story teaches us that no matter where we find ourselves, God's presence can turn any situation into a place of prosperity and favor if we remain faithful to him. However, Joseph's trials were not over. Potiphar's wife took notice of Joseph's good looks and tried to seduce him. Day after day she pursued him, but Joseph remained steadfast, refusing her advances. He declared that he could not sin against God or betray the trust of Potiphar. Eventually, Potiphar's wife, angered by Joseph's rejection, falsely accused him of attempting to assault her. Potiphar, believing his wife's lies, had Joseph thrown into prison. Joseph in prison, faithful in affliction. Once again, Joseph found himself in a seemingly hopeless situation. Wrongfully imprisoned, Joseph could have easily given in to despair, but he continued to trust in God's plan. And just as in Potiphar's house, the Lord was with Joseph in the prison. Genesis 39:21 says, "But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love." The prison warden saw that Joseph was a man of integrity and wisdom, so he put him in charge of all the other prisoners. Even in the darkest of circumstances, Joseph continued to glorify God through his conduct and his unwavering faith. In prison, Joseph encountered two of Pharaoh's officials, the cupbearer and the baker, who had also been imprisoned. Both men had troubling dreams, and Joseph, recognizing that the interpretation of dreams belongs to God, offered to interpret their dreams. The cupbearer's dream indicated that he would soon be restored to his position, while the baker's dream foretold his execution. Joseph's interpretations, by God's grace, proved accurate, and the cupbearer was restored to Pharaoh's service. Before the cupbearer left the prison, Joseph asked him to remember him and speak to Pharaoh on his behalf, hoping for release from his unjust imprisonment. However, the cupbearer forgot about Joseph for 2 long years. During this time, Joseph remained in prison, forgotten by men but never forgotten by God. This period of waiting, though painful, was part of God's divine plan. God was preparing Joseph for something far greater than he could have imagined. Joseph's rise to power. God's timing is perfect. After 2 years, Pharaoh himself had a series of disturbing dreams that none of his magicians or wise men could interpret. It was then that the cupbearer remembered Joseph and told Pharaoh about him. Joseph was summoned from the prison, cleaned up, and brought before Pharaoh. When Pharaoh asked Joseph if he could interpret the dreams, Joseph humbly replied, "I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." Genesis 41:16. Joseph, relying on God's wisdom, interpreted Pharaoh's dreams. He explained that Egypt would experience 7 years of abundant harvests followed by 7 years of severe famine. Joseph advised Pharaoh to appoint a wise and discerning man to oversee the collection of food during the years of plenty, so that the nation could survive the years of famine. Pharaoh, recognizing the Spirit of God in Joseph, appointed him as the ruler over all of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. In an instant, Joseph went from the prison to the palace, all because of God's perfect timing and providence. Joseph's role in God's plan, providing for Egypt and his family. As Joseph oversaw the collection and storage of food during the 7 years of abundance, Egypt became the center of the world's food supply. When the famine struck, people from all surrounding nations came to Egypt to buy grain, including Joseph's own brothers. Unbeknownst to them, the brother they had sold into slavery years earlier was now the powerful ruler they were bowing before, just as Joseph's prophetic dreams had foretold. Joseph could have chosen to seek revenge on his brothers for their betrayal, but instead he tested their hearts to see if they had changed. When he finally revealed his identity to them, Joseph wept and assured them that he harbored no bitterness. He recognized that everything that had happened, the betrayal, the slavery, the imprisonment, was part of God's plan to save lives. In Genesis 50:20, Joseph famously says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph's understanding of God's sovereignty is remarkable. He saw that every hardship he endured had a purpose, and that God was working behind the scenes to bring about his perfect will. Joseph's life glorifies God by showing us that even in the most painful circumstances, God is at work, weaving everything together for good. Joseph's reunion with his family. After revealing himself to his brothers, Joseph invited his entire family to come to Egypt to live in the land of Goshen, where he could provide for them during the remaining years of famine. Jacob, Joseph's father, was overjoyed to hear that his beloved son was alive. Jacob and his family moved to Egypt, and Joseph was reunited with his father, who had believed him dead for so many years. This reunion was a testimony to God's power to restore and redeem what was lost. Jacob blessed Joseph and his 2 sons, and before his death, Jacob praised God for his faithfulness in preserving Joseph and their family. Joseph's role in saving his family was crucial, as it ensured the survival of the future nation of Israel. God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob continued through Joseph's faithful service. Joseph's legacy and death. Joseph lived the remainder of his life in Egypt, serving Pharaoh and caring for his family. He lived to see his descendants grow and prosper in the land. Before his death, Joseph made his brothers swear that when God led the Israelites out of Egypt, they would carry his bones back to the Promised Land. This final request demonstrated Joseph's unwavering faith in God's covenant promises. Joseph died at the age of 110, full of years and honored by both the Egyptians and his own people. His life stands as a beacon of God's faithfulness, his providence, and his ability to bring good out of evil. Joseph's unwavering trust in God, even in the face of overwhelming trials, reminds us that God is sovereign over all circumstances, and his plans are always for our good and his glory. Joseph's faith in God's promises. Joseph's unwavering trust in God's promises is one of the most remarkable aspects of his life. Even in the midst of betrayal, slavery, imprisonment, and isolation, Joseph clung to the knowledge that God had a plan for his life. When his brothers sold him into slavery, Joseph could not have known the magnitude of God's purpose, but he remained faithful through every trial. His perseverance and faith in God were rewarded as God elevated him to a position of great influence. One of the most beautiful moments of Joseph's story is when he reassured his brothers that their evil actions were used by God for good. Joseph could have harbored bitterness or sought revenge, but instead he responded with forgiveness and grace. His statement in Genesis 50:20, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good," demonstrates Joseph's deep understanding of God's sovereignty. It also serves as a reminder that even when we face suffering, God is working behind the scenes, often in ways we cannot immediately see or comprehend. God's sovereignty and providence in Joseph's life. Throughout Joseph's life, we see God's sovereignty and providence clearly at work. From the moment Joseph was sold into slavery to his rise as the ruler of Egypt, every step of the way was orchestrated by God. Even the events that seemed disastrous, such as being falsely accused and imprisoned, were part of God's plan to position Joseph in the right place at the right time. God's providence is most evident in the timing of Joseph's rise to power. If Joseph had not been in prison at the exact moment Pharaoh had his dreams, he would not have had the opportunity to interpret them. If Joseph had not been sold into slavery, he would not have been in Egypt to save the nation from famine. Each of these seemingly tragic events was a stepping stone in God's plan to use Joseph as a vessel of salvation for Egypt and the surrounding nations, including his own family. Joseph's life is a testimony to the truth that God is always in control, even when circumstances seem bleak. No situation is beyond his reach, and no pain is wasted in his hands. God works all things together for good, for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Romans 8:28. Joseph's life is a powerful reminder of this truth. Joseph's character, faith, integrity, and forgiveness. Joseph's faith in God was unshakable, even when he faced great trials. His commitment to righteousness is seen in his refusal to give in to temptation, as when Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him. Joseph's response, "How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Genesis 39:9. Reveals his deep reverence for God and his determination to live a life of integrity, even when no one was watching. His resistance to sin despite the consequences shows his unwavering dedication to God's will. Forgiveness is another key aspect of Joseph's character. When Joseph had the power to exact revenge on his brothers, he chose forgiveness instead. Rather than dwelling on their betrayal, Joseph saw the bigger picture, God's hand at work. He extended grace to those who had wronged him, restoring his family and breaking the cycle of bitterness and hatred. This forgiveness is a reflection of the grace that God offers to us, and it sets a powerful example of how we, too, should forgive those who hurt us. God's glory, revealed in Joseph's story. At every turn in Joseph's life, we see God being glorified. Through Joseph's trials, God's faithfulness was made evident, and through Joseph's rise to power, God's wisdom and providence were on full display. By placing Joseph in a position of authority in Egypt, God not only saved Egypt and the surrounding nations from famine, but also preserved the nation of Israel, fulfilling his covenant promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God's work in Joseph's life also foreshadows the greater story of redemption that would come through Jesus Christ. Just as Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, and suffered unjustly before being exalted to a position of authority and saving many, so too was Jesus betrayed, sold, and crucified, only to be exalted, and provide salvation for all who believe. Joseph's life points to the greater story of God's redemptive plan for humanity, and it is a reminder that God uses all things, even suffering, to accomplish his purposes. The legacy of Joseph. Joseph's legacy is one of faith, perseverance, and trust in God's providence. His story teaches us that God is with us, even in the most difficult times, and that he is always working for our good and his glory. Joseph's life stands as a beacon of hope, showing us that no matter how dark our circumstances may seem, God has a plan and a purpose. Joseph's faithfulness to God, his forgiveness toward his brothers, and his unwavering trust in God's plan continue to inspire believers today. His life is a powerful example of how God can take what was meant for evil and turn it into good. In the end, Joseph's life glorifies God in every way, as it showcases his faithfulness, his sovereignty, and his love for his people. Joseph's final words to his brothers before his death were filled with hope and faith in God's promises. He told them that God would surely come to their aid and bring them out of Egypt, back to the land he had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This statement shows that, even at the end of his life, Joseph's faith in God's covenant never wavered. He knew that God would continue to fulfill his promises, just as he had throughout his own life. Conclusion: glorifying God in Joseph's life. The life of Joseph is a stunning testimony of God's providence, faithfulness, and glory. From the pit to the palace, from slavery to sovereignty, Joseph's life shows us that God is always in control, even when circumstances seem dire. Through betrayal, false accusations, and imprisonment, Joseph never lost faith in God's promises, and in the end, God exalted him to a position of great power and influence. Joseph's story glorifies God by showing that he is the ultimate author of our lives. Even when others intend harm, God can use it for good. Even when we are in the darkest valleys, God is working to fulfill his plans for us. Joseph's life is a reminder that no situation is too difficult for God to redeem, and that he is always working for the good of those who love him. As we reflect on Joseph's life, we are reminded to trust in God's timing, to remain faithful in adversity, and to always look to him for guidance and strength. Just as God was with Joseph in every trial, he is with us, shaping our lives according to his perfect will. Joseph's life encourages us to glorify God in all circumstances, knowing that he is sovereign and that his plans for us are always for good, for his glory, and for the blessing of others.